Aloha my CACAO. I'm Tamara Butterbaugh, chocolate sommelier of Manoa Chocolate, Hawaii, right here on the island of Oahu. We're one of many of the beautiful Hawaiian islands surrounded by the vast Pacific Ocean, and we have a gorgeous tropical climate. So we're working to make Hawaii known as one of the finest places and known for its cacao and chocolate making. On this journey, we're going to explore a cacao orchard and learn the nuances of farming and fermentation. Then we're going to visit our Bean to Bar chocolate factory and meet with Dylan Butterbaugh, our chocolate maker and founder, and learn the nuances to the art of craft chocolate. In the end, we're going to finish in our gorgeous tasting room, and we're going to try a virtual tasting of our collection. And next, we're going to go into the orchard. In a beautiful cacao orchard in Waimanalo on Oahu. I want to discuss with you now the farming and post-harvest practices that go into making fine chocolate. When you're tasting fine chocolate single origin, you want to enjoy the terroir. That's a French wine term which refers to really tasting the place. There's 3 essential factors that contribute to tasting the region when you're stripping down the recipe and tasting the cacao itself. Number 1 is the environment. That is the soil that the cacao trees are growing, the rainfall patterns, the elevation. Number 2 is the genetics of the trees. There's different types of cacao trees, just as we might enjoy a Cabernet Sauvignon versus a Sauvignon Blanc, different types of grapes that make wine. They're both grapes, but each one tastes different because of the characteristics of the cacao itself. And the third is the post-harvest handling, the fermentation and drying process. We're going to get into that in detail, but terroir is an important factor in tasting chocolate from different regions. Let's take a moment and talk about how the cacao tree grows, generally speaking. You'll find cacao growing 20 degrees north and south of the equator, so anywhere tropical. In Hawaii, we're a special exception because we're 21 degrees, but we're surrounded by the Pacific Ocean, which moderates our climate. So we have the perfect tropical climate to grow cacao. This makes us the only state in the United States that has the capacity to grow cacao commercially for export. Cacao is named, the tree itself is called Theobroma cacao. That's the scientific name for the tree. It's native to the Amazonian basin in South America. And the indigenous peoples, the ancient peoples, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Olmecs, really it was a sacred crop that they carried the fruit with them as they settled different parts of Central and South America. Now, it thrives in the understory of the rainforest, and it loves shade and doesn't like wind. So in the wild, you'll find cacao tucked under the canopy of a rainforest where it's protected. The trees can be, if there's a puka or a hole in the canopy, quite tall. They can reach 20, 30, 50 feet perhaps. But really, they want to be under the shade of larger trees. And so in an orchard environment, it's best to keep them low, 15 to 20 feet tall, so that you can have ease of harvest. It's grown all over the world, and each region of the world has so much potential to develop their terroir. For makers, craft chocolate makers, to seek these unique origins, work with farmers there, and help develop that region's style. Rather than mix and blend, we want to try each part of the world. We want to try all of the Hawaiian Islands as we develop our industry here, and we can't wait to try other chocolates from all over the globe and compare the differences just as we do with wine. Okay, let's discuss harvesting and farming. The trees, because they're small, shade-loving orchard trees, you want to keep them 8 to 10 feet apart, so that way you can easily access them and give them space for their canopy. It'll take about 3.5, 4 years until you get your first fruit. The trees have these tiny little flowers, about the size of a dime, and there's a pollinator that it's not a bee, not a beetle, not a bird, but it's actually something called a midge, which is a microscopic, almost like a fruit fly, but not a fruit fly, it's a midge. You cannot see it with the human eye, it's so tiny. It actually lives in the leaf litter of the orchard. So after 3.5, 4 years, you're going to get your fruiting season. Pods start out as these tiny little shirelles, is what we call them. And they are going to produce fruit off of the main trunk and branches. As we mentioned before, there's different varieties of cacao. When you plant the cacao tree by the seedling, it's almost like apples. It's not necessarily true to seed. So you don't know exactly what variety you have if you're just sharing seeds amongst farmers. If you really want to cultivate a certain variety of cacao, you'll have to do tissue culture and grafting. So in this orchard, we have multiple different types of cacao, and we're studying them to see which ones are the best producers and the best tasting in this environment. It's really exciting. Some pods are red, light, almost like mint green. Some are orange. There's different spectrum of colors, and colors don't necessarily indicate what type of cacao it is, but there's many different factors, from the taste of the fruit to the color of the seed inside. Sometimes the color of the seed inside is a deep, beautiful, almost majestic purple, and sometimes they're white and have a different amount of bitterness or astringency. Even the fruit itself that we're going to experience tastes different. Sometimes it tastes like lychee, watermelon, cantaloupe. Sometimes it tastes like lemon. And so cacao has so many different varieties, and as we develop this industry further, it'll be interesting to learn more and more about how different varietals taste. Now, when it's time to harvest, you'll know, because the pod is going to change color oftentimes completely from its original state. That's not always true depending on the variety, but this one should turn a bright sort of sunrise orange when it's ready. And if you know your trees, you know that they started green and then turned yellow, or started a deep, deep maroon and then maybe turned into a bright red. Depending on where cacao grows, there's different seasons. In Hawaii, we have kind of an early harvest in the sort of winter season, so like December through January, and then February, March, April, springtime, we're going to get our peak harvest. And what happens is the cacao trees start to produce flowers, and then once they're pollinated, it'll take a full 6 months until the pods are ripe and ready for harvest. Now, when we talk about fine chocolate, we're really interested in how the cacao itself tastes. So cacao, when we use that term, we're referring to the tree, the fruit, the pod, the seed, and the raw material that goes into our chocolate factory to turn into chocolate. So fine chocolate is fine because of how the beans are handled on the farm. So the difference between industrial mass-produced chocolate is going to be which pods the farmers choose to harvest, whether or not they're ripe and ready, versus just harvesting whatever's there. And then also the post-harvest handling, which is a process of fermentation and drying. And that is really key. So you can grow great chocolate anywhere. There's potential for all chocolate to taste great. But ultimately, it's down to the farmer's hands to determine the quality based on how they process the beans. So let's open this up and take a look at what it looks like inside, and then we'll go into detail onto fermentation. So sometimes the pods can be about the size of an American football. I've had one bigger than my face, which is really exciting. I'm going to go ahead and kind of gently crack the outer husk. So there's a kind of a thick pod wall. Some are thicker than others depending on the variety of cacao. Inside this pod, you're going to find a cluster, of about, generally speaking, about 30 to 60 seeds inside. And this cluster has a beautiful, sweet, delectable fruit. Sort of dissolves onto your tongue, and it's really juicy and tropical fruit, delicious. So it's like Starburst or Jolly Rancher sort of candy. It's really tart and sweet. And as I mentioned, some are more cantaloupe, some are more lychee, some are more floral. Inside are the cocoa beans, but they start out with this layer of sweet pulp surrounding it. If we dissect it with our two front teeth, you'll notice that deep, beautiful sort of purple color, and that's the chocolate itself. So while the fruit, the pulp is delicious and sweet, inside, as you bite into the cacao bean, it's actually quite bitter. It dries out your tongue and it tastes astringent. It's not very pleasant. Some are more bitter than others, more astringent than others in the raw form. This one is not too bad, but it's not anything like the finished chocolate that we're gonna get. So the key important thing to understand is that fine chocolate, there's care in the way that it's harvested. You need to have an abundance of wet seed to extract and put into a large wooden box. So ideally 500 to thousands of pods at once, all ripe and ready to go. What's going to happen is the cacao is going to be taken to a facility that's out in the open but under roof, so protected from the rain. And as the cacao is scooped out of its pods and put into the fermentation boxes, the sweet pulp surrounding the beans are going to interact with wild yeast and bacteria from that particular environment. And what's happening is there's going to be a spontaneous fermentation that occurs. So there's a chemical process that happens in which the sugars are converting to alcohols, and the whole pile is spiking in temperature. And as a result, the beans inside are transforming not only in color, but also in flavor. And the beans are essentially, in some ways, cooking in their own sweet pulp through the heat that comes from the fermentation process. So farmers have to take special care to monitor the temperature of the pile, introduce oxygen at key times and temperatures a series of times, and mix the pile evenly, and then stop the fermentation at the exact moment so as to not over ferment. And then the beans will be ultimately laid out in the sun for a series of days for drying and curing. So fermentation is on average 5 to 10 days. And drying is up to 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the amount of solar radiation in the area. So those two things, fermentation and drying, harvesting with care, post-harvest, that's the most important part of fine chocolate. So we really, in craft chocolate, exist in a realm of dealing with farmers that are innovating and taking cacao to the next level, where it's more of a prized, value-added product in the end than a cheap commodity to be exported. So fermentation develops flavor, and that's going to be the most important thing that we're interested in as makers. We want to be able to tell the story of how this particular region tastes, and you won't be able to experience that if fermentation isn't done properly. There'll be too much noise in the bean, too much bitterness, too much flaws if it's not fermented properly, that you won't be able to taste what this particular varietal or environment has to offer. We just came from the farm where we discussed the growing and fermentation and drying, which is the most important step in fine craft chocolate. Now here we are in Kailua town, which is about 15 minutes away, and we're in our bean to bar chocolate factory. Here we're in the tasting room where we're going to enjoy a virtual tasting experience, but first we're going to meet Dylan Butterbaugh, the founder and owner of Manoa Chocolate, and he's going to describe to us how we take the raw material, the fermented dried seed, and turn it into dark chocolate.
Hi, my name is Dylan Butterbaugh, and I am the founder of Manoa Chocolate. I'm going to walk you guys through each step in our process from bean all the way to bar. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to take a look at some of these beans. Now, we receive cacao in large burlap sacks. They're somewhere between 60 and 70 kilos. And these are a very prime example of what quality cacao would look like. This, just looking at it doesn't tell us it's going to be great, but the first indicator of quality is in the appearance here. They're all very consistent in size. They smell like vinegar, which tells me that the ferment went well and that acetic acid developed and penetrated inside that seed and made it more palatable to us, because a raw cacao seed off the tree doesn't taste so good. But once it ferments, it begins to develop very interesting notes that we later taste in chocolate. And so this bag here is exceptional. And what I would do next as a chocolate maker is we would receive a sample of this. I would taste it and then determine if we want to purchase a larger quantity or not, before then determining a roast profile. So now we're going to go step by step here and start talking about roasting. But the sourcing is still the most important part a chocolate maker can do based on the quality that the farmer produces. Now, roasting. We use a coffee roaster in our case, and it works in a very similar way as coffee, except that we are roasting at a much lighter temperature for about twice as long. So in chocolate, I'm going to give you some average numbers. We roast around 250 degrees Fahrenheit for around 30 minutes. That would be a medium roast for Manoa chocolate in this roaster. On the low side, we might go to 235 degrees Fahrenheit for, say, it would be a longer amount of time, maybe 40, 45 minutes. That would be very long and very light. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we might do 265 degrees Fahrenheit and maybe roast for 23 minutes. So that's our range there. And the reason I gave you that is because depending on where in the world these are coming from, they're going to taste different, just like grapes. You have terroir influences. So that's roasting for you. This is our second most important step after sourcing. Now, what we've covered is roasting. We're moving on to our next step, which means cracking. We have to crack the cacao into little fragments so we can separate the shell from what we call the nib. Now we have the pre-roasted cacao right here and the post-roasted cacao here, and you can see the color difference. It's much grayer. It becomes much easier to crack and remove the shell. And so we've got a very simple cracking device. It's kind of modeled after a nut cracker, and there's two sets of rollers that roll together at the top and then two right below that. And so everything goes through and breaks into little pieces or fragments. It slides right out the bottom, and then we could move on to our next step, which is winnowing. So I'm gonna explain what this is right here. We have a big hopper up here, and once you have cracked the nibs and shells, they mix together, and you can see that here. The shell is light fragments, and the nib is more dense. And so everything at the top of this hopper is fed through and down this chute, and this contraption here has this water wheel type of device with little hands, and it's grabbing everything from the top, and it's slowly feeding it at a consistent rate down this chute and into this long neck. Now there's a fan down here, and it's very similar to a bouncy castle fan. It's blowing air all the way up and down into this yellow bin. So what that means is anything that enters the middle here, if it's light, it's going up, and if it's heavy, it's going down. We end up with nibs coming out the bottom and shells going into the yellow bin. That is how we winnow or separate our cacao nibs from our cacao shells. Now that we've got nibs that have come out of the bottom of the winnower, we need to smash them up. And I was describing earlier how you can take a nib and you can throw it in your mouth and chew on it, and your teeth are making chocolate because of what this is made of. It's half cocoa butter and half cocoa solids, mainly consisting of cocoa powder. Now these two things are going to go through our next machine, which is called a 4-roll pre-refiner. And what this does is it's going to go through, just like the cracking device, two sets of rollers that look like steam rollers, though in this case. They're like stones, very smooth and spaced very tight together, and as the nibs go through, it turns into a paste. It comes off the conveyor, and we're ready to move on to the next step, which is to load it into our ball mill. So let's go check out our ball mill through this room here. I've got to go ahead and throw my hairnet on, and then we're going to go through our castle doors. Ready? Here we go. All right. Come on in. We're going to keep this room closed. There's a lot of heat that's getting kicked off in this room because the machines here have hot water flowing through them. And we'll come to that in a second. But these are called ball mills. This is our milk chocolate ball mill, and this is our dark chocolate ball mill. And I'm going to go ahead and bring you guys over with me here. It's a little bit loud in here, but when you have nibs, there's a few ways that you can refine it. We like to run ours through a 4-roll pre-refiner, but in this case, we loaded it straight into the stone melangers. And a melanger is it's a French word for mix. It's just what we call these wet stone grinders. 2 stones. We're gonna turn it off for a sec. Come take a look inside here. We've got 2 stones and a stone base. And what's happening is as we load the nibs in, it's crushing and all the cocoa butter is now mixing with the cocoa solids. And very quickly, we start to have what looks like chocolate. So this is now what we would call chocolate because at this point we add sugar. And sugar determines your percentage of chocolate. Because if you have a nib and you crush it up, it's 100% chocolate. As soon as we add 20% sugar, we have an 80% chocolate remaining. So that's what the percentage means on a bar. In this case, we're probably making a 70% chocolate. I'm going to turn this guy back on, and we're going to go talk about our ball mills, because this is a different way of refining. So come with me. So the ball mill here, I can feel it, it's still hot. It's got a water jacket around it to help us regulate temperature. We take the crushed up nibs, and we put it through this hatch here, and it goes inside, and there's about 100,000 little ball bearings of extremely hard metal, and there's a shaft that runs right down the middle with arms. And as we turn it on and it starts to agitate all the balls together, a lot of friction happens, creating a lot of heat. Not only is a lot of heat created, but the friction and the rubbing together of the balls is now refining the chocolate to a much smaller micron size. And so each of these steps now are helping us reduce the size of the chocolate and mix in sugar very evenly, as well as control acids and whatnot. But for now, we're going to keep this basic, where we just need to reduce the micron size of the chocolate. And this helps with the texture of the chocolate in your mouth. So I'm going to give you a comparison between the two machines we just looked at. We had the stone grinder, the wet stone grinder, and we have our ball mill. The reason we like using our ball mill more is because the distribution curve of the micron size of the chocolate and the sugar is very tight together. I'm gonna simplify that. Every size, every size of sugar and chocolate is somewhere between, say, 15 and 17 microns. That's a tight distribution curve of the sizes. In the other stone melanger, the stone grinder there, you're gonna have a wider distribution curve, a bigger range of sizes. You might have 5 microns and you might have 25 microns. And so when you eat a piece of chocolate and that melts in your mouth, it's not going to feel as silky and smooth as the one that was 15 to 17 microns. And it's a really subtle thing. You wouldn't notice grittiness per se, but you will enjoy the texture of this one more in most cases. And this is also subjective, but it's our style of chocolate making. We want that really nice texture. And I think it helps taste more when you have a even distribution curve of the micron sizes. What happens next is we've achieved the texture we want. We can open a valve here. This valve opens up and it pumps over to our next machine, which is called a conch. And the conch right now is half full, but this is all transferred over now. And the conch is going to help us additionally improve texture, as well as infuse oxygen. We're adding oxygen into the chocolate, and it's volatilizing acetic acid. That's meaning it's burning off vinegar and other compounds we don't necessarily want. So as the chocolate gets circulated around, it gets pumped through here, up, back over, and we can blow hot air on it. And what happens is it's now going through the vent. The air is getting sucked through the screen here and it's blowing right out the vent. And so that's how we're additionally balancing our chocolate, so that when you put that piece of chocolate in your mouth, you're not getting any sharp acids like feeling in the back of your throat. If we don't do that with some of them, you'll feel this acidy feeling in the back of your throat that we don't really want. So this is helping us with balance. It's just making the chocolate even better. After this, we have one more really important step in the chocolate making process, which is to now mold it. So we have to temper and mold our chocolate. So follow me, we're gonna go talk about tempering. Now we're in our tempering room. What we have to do now is structure the cocoa butter that's naturally in the chocolate into a grid formation. Cocoa butter has 6 crystals in it, and I want you to think of them as Lego blocks. When we cool off the chocolate, all these 6 crystals that are scattered around, all these 6 Legos, they start coming closer and closer and closer and tighter, to the point where we literally get them to click together as if they were Legos, and this is actually why your chocolate has that snap. So this is a very important phase for us to do. This is why your chocolate has this even shine. I know some of you have seen your chocolate look like it's got this film on it. It looks old or moldy. It's not. What it means is that the cocoa butter that's naturally in the chocolate has begun to separate based on a certain temperature fluctuation. Now, this happens in your jar of peanut butter as well. You'll sometimes see the oil at the top of the peanut butter jar. You don't throw your peanut butter jar away. You just mix it back in and homogenize the texture of it all. Same thing for us. If you ever saw your chocolate bar that has this white film on top, all you got to do is melt it and mix it back up. Now, if you want to do a really good job, you would hand temper it, which you can watch a YouTube video. We've got them on there, how to do this. It's fun, it's messy, it's not something you want to do without a machine on a bigger scale, so we're going to describe our machine here. The bowl here is hot. It's getting sucked internally and cooled off through an auger through the back and dispensed through this depositing head a little bit warmed. We would take a mold, we slide the mold under, it deposits chocolate onto the mold. We would then run it down our vibrating conveyor right here, and then we would load them into our refrigerators. If all of this process goes well and we hit the right numbers, we will have structured chocolate bars that will pop nicely out of the mold. They'll look beautiful, and we would then do our very last step, which is to flow wrap and package the bars, which is right here. So we have a biodegradable film that we use. It looks like plastic. It's a cellulose, it's a plant fiber, and it goes through these forming horns and sealing jaws. And this machine is a wonderful machine because no one really wants to package thousands of bars a day. So this helps us do it at about 60 to 70 a minute. And we'll load the conveyor there, and then it'll go through and package our chocolate bars and seal them and go out the other side, and it goes through a metal detector before we capture it and then do the final outer package by hand. And now I know a lot of you are thinking, why does it go through a metal detector? Just about all your food that you've ever bought in a supermarket has gone through a metal detector or X-ray machine, because any manufacturing process at any scale is using a lot of metal held together with nuts and bolts. And so it's just a common practice that we also adhere to. So there we go. That is how we make chocolate at Manoa Chocolate, from bean to bar. I hope this was informative for you all, and enjoy your chocolate. Aloha.
I want to take a moment and frame for you all the importance of what's happening in the world of fine chocolate and global chocolate really at this time. Billions of people enjoy chocolate, and it's something that we tend to take for granted. I didn't even know that chocolate came from a fruit when I first tasted it. I was, like many people, disconnected from the source, the fruit, the farms, the raw material when it comes from when you go and have a chocolate bar or chocolate candy. So we tend to have that experience in industrial chocolate, thinking about the brand name or the region that manufactured the chocolate, but not the source of the cacao itself. Unfortunately, in that system, cacao, which is the raw material that comes from the fruit itself that we turn into chocolate, is traded globally as a very cheap commodity. And it goes through many, many hands and brokers before it ends up in the chocolate factory where it's converted from bean to bar. And unfortunately, so many hands touch the cacao on the commodities market that we often don't think about the livelihoods and the social impact that we're having on the farmers that grow the cacao in that market. There's nothing inherently wrong with mass-produced industrial processed candy as long as the bean supply is socially responsible. So we can enjoy candy all day long with very little cacao in the ingredients, but it's important to understand that oftentimes the unintended consequences of a supply chain where beans are cheap, it becomes a race to the bottom. And when so many hands go through the brokerage of the beans, they become so disconnected from the source, from the farmers, that ultimately these prices don't take care of good living wages for people. And unfortunately, you'll find human trafficking, child slavery, major social issues tied up in the sale of cacao. And a lot of people don't realize that the vast majority of cacao that's supplying the global market for all the big industrial brands is coming roughly 70% from two countries in West Africa, Ivory Coast and Ghana. That's the lion's share of the global supply. And while originally that's good for Ivory Coast and Ghana to enter global market and global trade, we need to make sure that the price that we're paying for the cacao can actually take care of the costs of good, fair living wages. And that hasn't been the case for the last 30 years or so. Enter the American craft chocolate movement, bean to bar. It's no longer just makers that are feeling socially responsible and want to change the world in the US. It's now happening all over the planet, where small batch makers, akin to the microbrewer industry in beer, are passionate about changing the world of chocolate, and we want to have real relationships with our farmers. So rather than sourcing cacao through brokers, what we're doing is taking the fair trade concept and going even further, paying much higher prices through direct trade. So it's totally different than industrial chocolate. It's a different style and it's a different experience. In mass-produced industrial chocolate, you're getting cheap beans from all over the world, mixing, blending. Ultimately, it's going into a factory where all the origins are mixed together and you're adding lots of additives. Sometimes you're even stripping away the flavors through a chemical process to remove bitterness. So the end consumer in industrial chocolate isn't going to be interested in tasting the quality of the cacao because they're going to be experiencing a manufactured taste in a candy bar. That's going to be very different from the approach that bean-to-bar craft chocolate makers have. When we talk about fine chocolate, it's much more like enjoying a glass of wine. When wine connoisseurs enjoy a glass, they want to know the name of the grape and hear the story about the regions that produced that particular vintage. They want to taste that area and honor the place where it was grown. That's what craft chocolate does with cacao beans. We're going to be working with farmers all over the world through direct trade, sourcing exquisite, beautiful beans that have been carefully harvested and processed. And then throughout the process, we actually want to taste the cacao itself. So rather than having very little percentage of cacao in the finished candy, we're ultimately going to be tasting a higher percentage of cacao and actually enjoying the terroir, or the soil and the climate that that region has to offer. From the orchards into the factory, we just learned how chocolate is transformed from the raw material, the dried seed, to the finished chocolate bars. Just as a sommelier would teach you about the grape varietals and the place where the grape was grown, I'm a chocolate sommelier, and it's my job to help people who come into our bean-to-bar factory tour experience understand what they're tasting. Just as in wine, we want to know where it's coming from, where it's grown, and how the terroir affects the flavor. So in our collection, we have, generally speaking, in this industry, craft chocolate, single origin, and that's where you're labeling exactly where the cacao is grown. You can talk about single varietal, single estate. Single origin just means that all the cacao is coming from one particular area. Since we've opened this factory, we've worked with beans from Costa Rica, Belize, we've worked with Papua New Guinea, Samoa, all throughout the Hawaiian Islands. More and more we're getting Hawaiian chocolate entering our collection, and we're really excited about that. But as a bean-to-bar maker, our passion as its other makers like us share this, we want to taste origins from all over the world to appreciate the differences. Now, with single origin, we have what's here known as a tasting wheel. And here, we're not saying that we added these flavors. We have categories like roasted, earthy, nutty, buttery, spicy, herbaceous, and there's different potential flavors that we're going to be experiencing just as we would with coffee or wine when we bite into the single origin dark chocolate bars. So when you open the bar and you begin to taste, you want to focus on the start, the middle, the finish. Let the flavors evolve on your palate. And the main goal is pay attention to what you're experiencing. And if it's a fine, high quality dark chocolate, it should have layers of flavor that develop and open up as you experience the bar. So I want to talk to you folks about, first of all, our Hawaii dark chocolate. This is a 70% from the Kona side of the Big Island. This is one of our classic bars that we've had the pleasure of working with from the beginning. When you taste, it's going to begin with a buttery melt, a malted quality. It almost has the mouthfeel of a milk chocolate, even though it's just, again, 70% cacao, 30% organic cane sugar, nothing else is influencing the flavor. The organic cane sugar is flavor neutral, and yet you're tasting hints of dark berries, blueberries. Sometimes we get like a hibiscus and a floral tone in this dark chocolate. So this is beautiful paired because it's mellow and malted and deep, but yet soft and mild like a milk chocolate with floral qualities. It's gorgeous with a Pinot Noir. That's our Hawaii 70% dark chocolate. Now, in contrast, if we were going to taste our Tanzania bar from Cocoa Camili, again, we talked earlier in the program about social responsibility, how important it is to know where your beans come from. This is a wonderful organization over in East Africa, where they work with about 400 different, actually it's 4,000 farmers in the region, and help everybody get much higher prices and great living wages because they're doing such a beautiful job with fermentation and drying and accessing the craft chocolate market. Everybody knows Tanzania is fruity and bright. It has, when you first bite into it, it pops with a zest of like orange rind, citrus, sometimes almost like lemon, and often it moves into a deeper, rich, dark cherry tone. Really bright, almost like cranberries, and you would be surprised that we didn't add fruit into this bar. So when you're doing single origin, you're tasting side by side literally the same recipe. The difference is where the beans are grown, and you're really able to taste a vast range of flavors in the finished chocolate. This one, believe it or not, I pair it with a white wine, a Sauvignon Blanc, because of the bright, fruity, almost lemony tones, works well with the acidity of a Sauvignon Blanc. Last but not least, I want to finish in Esmeraldas, Ecuador. This is one of our favorite origins. It's a single estate and a single varietal. So the bean that the variety of chocolate is called Neo Nacional. So it's actually an indigenous variety of this particular region. And they're working with their university there, the University of Esmeraldas, to, rather than work with generic cacao beans, actually save the indigenous varietal that grows in that region. It has so much balance. When you taste this bar, it takes a moment to open up, but when you first bite in, it's almost like hazelnut cream. Each vintage is slightly different in craft chocolate, just as it would be with wine. So lately, as I've been tasting this creamy hazelnut, rich roasted tone, I've also been getting a little bit of a coconut cream quality in the middle. It has a really round mouthfeel, almost the way you would enjoy, the way that New American Oak softens the tannins in wines. You get the coconut dill, sort of, it reminds me of an oak barrel. And then it finishes quite floral. So it's really smooth and mellow. It doesn't have as much of the malted base as the Hawaii dark chocolate. It's not super fudgy. It's more like a caramelized, roasty hazelnut meets coconut cream. And it's gorgeous with any classic red wine from like a California Cab. Is just perfect. It matches the same sort of mouthfeel. So that's the single origin concept. And makers like us also tend to do a 70% with the cacao bean and the origin as the primary experience. And so what that helps us do is when you open up the bar, you can learn about the place and the people that grew the chocolate. And over time, we'll come to be connoisseurs of different regions of chocolate in the world. On to our inclusions. We're going to feature today our breakfast bar. This is our best seller. We love this bar because it's featuring the roasted cacao nibs. They make a crunchy texture. It's almost having a granola type quality. On the back of this bar, in addition to the roasted cacao nibs that give it this fun crunch, we also sprinkle Kona coffee. So it's just a light dusting. And so this bar is a 60% dark milk base. So it's going to be nice and balanced. It's 60% still technically dark chocolate, but we added about 10% milk to the recipe to kind of just mellow it out. And so it's balancing the coffee flavor. That's just one example of many inclusions we can do. And then last but not least, I want to just talk about our 72% dark chocolate sea salt. And this is an example of what we call a world blend. So just like in wine, you can do your single origins, your single estates, but also you can make a house blend. So once we are familiar with different regions of the world that we've been working with, we know the profile of the beans, the different qualities of the chocolate from each area, then we can be more informed about making a beautiful house blend featuring maybe 3 different regions for balance. And so we do that with this chocolate bar. It's a 72% dark chocolate. It's featuring a little bit of our Esmeraldas, Ecuador, a little bit of our Ucayali, Peru in the Amazon, and a little bit of our Tanzania for some brightness. That becomes a beautiful base dark chocolate. There's no dairy added, and then we sprinkle sea salt on the back because salty and sweet, you can't go wrong. Now, believe it or not, because it's fine chocolate, it's more like cheese, we don't just think dark chocolate, red wine. The sea salt, for example, can be paired gorgeously with a sparkling. Could be a Cava Brut, Prosecco, or a Champagne, or even a buttery Chardonnay. So that has been our chocolate factory tour experience. We went to the farm. We learned about the harvesting and fermentation and the drying of the seeds. We came to our factory. We learned about each step in the manufacturing process with Dylan, and finished with a virtual tasting and understanding of the collection of fine chocolate that comes out of our factory here at Manoa. We hope you enjoyed the experience, and remember, always think about the origin of where your chocolate comes from. Let's make sure that we're all being conscious consumers when it comes to chocolate, and maybe switch towards fine chocolate, thinking about who grew the cacao. Are they being paid properly? And who made the chocolate? Where was it manufactured? And was it done with care? We hope you enjoy this experience, and check out Craft Chocolate TV if you'd like to dive further into the details to learn more.